Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Just wanted to share some ideas today about joy as a spiritual path. I'm getting a lot of information from people I talk to, people there's a sadness, there's a fear, there's worry that this lines. I hear a lot of people saying, well, I got to turn off the news. I can't stand the news. I can't stand all the negative talk. I got to leave Facebook and all these kind of things. And there's just kind of this kind of almost feeling of doom or gloom or the chaos. My God, things are just so in turmoil. And what we want to talk about today is getting out of that and staying out of that. And recognizing, as Alan Cohen said in his book, joy is our compass. Joy. We weren't meant to be afraid. We weren't meant to struggle. We weren't meant to have all these worries and concerns. These are constructs of the human mind. These are constructs of human consciousness. And there's a reason that we do it. We'll talk about it briefly. But the important thing is, let it go. Let it go. Let's get out of that nonsense. Now there are folks who are in that, and they are stuck in that, and they're going to stay stuck in that until they get tired of it and they're ready to move out. And we understand that that's part of a phase and that's part of their growth. But we don't have to stay stuck as well. There's an old saying, when the blind lead the blind, they both wind up in the ditch. Somebody has to see. Somebody has to move forward. So we want to talk a little bit then about, first of all, why do we as human beings, why do we believe that everything has to be so hard? Why do we have to make it so hard? There's something in our culture, and it's ingrained. I mean, you can see it. If you start looking for it, you will see it everywhere. I even hear folks complaining about, well, these days kids participate in a sport and everybody gets a trophy, and that's not right, because everybody doesn't deserve a trophy. Somebody needs to win. And it's this idea that somebody needs to win, that the competition needs to be difficult, and somebody has to strive, and somebody has to raise to the top. So therefore, we can't acknowledge that everybody else got in there and did their best. Everybody else got in there and participated. We take things that don't need to be hard in our society, and we find a way to make them hard. And the reason I believe that this is so is that it is kind of an unconscious value that's part of our culture in this part of the world, in this Western part of the world. There's something in our culture that says, if it's good, it has to be hard. If it's good, it has to be hard. The no pain, no gain school of life. Everything has to be difficult. I was reading a piece not too long ago about medical students, and years ago I was in school and I thought I wanted to go to pre-med, and I was learning a lot about what medical students went through. And there's this rite of passage almost that the medical students go through, where they have to work these long shifts, like they have to be on call in the hospital for hours at a time. And I remember when Lori was about to have our first child, we went to the hospital in the middle of the night, and we went in through the emergency room door, and there was a whole wall just lined up of wheelchairs that were there by the emergency room door, and it was filled with young people dressed in medical gowns, and they were sleeping. They were sleeping in these chairs, and we walked by and they kind of looked up dazed, and then they tried to quickly go back to sleep. And these were the young people on call. These were the young people studying to be doctors who were there. And the reason for that, the original reason for that, was that it was believed that it was necessary for the doctors in training to be able to see the progression of a case over a 24-hour period. So if somebody came into the hospital with a certain condition, the doctors needed to be able to observe that as it progressed through a 24-hour period, so they would be able to understand what that particular condition looked like at different stages of development. And that was the original reasoning behind it. But I believe that it became more a rite of passage, that this this need to work hard and to make it hard is a way of weeding out the people who weren't tough enough to make it. If you think about today, if you want to observe something over a 24-hour period, we have cameras, we have video recording, we have audio recording. You can record a patient's progress, in real time, and then play it back for a class. You can say, well, this is what the condition looked like at 6 hours, and this is what it looked like at 7 hours. So the need to be there in real time for 24 hours is, in my opinion, no longer necessary. But nevertheless, just recently, a few weeks ago, perhaps a month ago, there was a story in the press that medical schools have extended that now. They can work up to 30 hours a day. So I think the reason that we do things like this is that there's a certain sense of accomplishment that we get when we do something that is difficult, that we do something that other people couldn't do, that they tried and they failed, but we succeeded. I was watching a documentary series produced many years ago. Gwynne Dyer is the journalist's name, and it's an excellent series. And I believe it's called The Path to Total War is the name of it. It was produced for Canadian Broadcasting, like the Canadian version of PBS. I think it was a 4 or 5 part series. The whole thing's available now on YouTube or Vimeo, one of those sites. But Mr. Dyer went to boot camp in different parts of the world. He went to basic training for military forces. He went to Parris Island. He followed a group of Marine recruits as they went through basic training. And then he went to Russia, and he followed a group of new recruits as they went through basic training in Russia. And his observation was that basic training is pretty much the same wherever you go. Basic training is basic training. Now, when you're undergoing basic training, you're being told that you're part of the best and the brightest, and you're receiving the best training in the world. But everybody tells their recruits that there was no difference between them. That you're the rough, you're the tough, and all these things that we had to repeat when we were marching and going along in our training. But what Gwynne Dyer said that stuck with me, and I saw this as it was being broadcast the first time in the 80s, and it stuck with me all these years. He said that boot camp, if you think about it, boot camp has to be easy enough that 95% of high school graduates can complete it, because that's where most of the young people going into the Army were coming from. They get out of high school and they were going into the armies. So boot camp had to be easy enough that 95% of the people who went through it completed. But it had to be difficult enough that 5% couldn't. And the reason it had to be that difficult, so that everybody couldn't pass, was so that the other 95% could feel good about themselves. In other words, and I was there and I saw people, getting washed out as they went through it, and the other people who were there were saying, well, I'm not like that guy, I'm not like him, and they felt good about themselves, that they were accomplishing something that other people couldn't do. So it had to be more, it had to be difficult. They had to make it difficult so that people would feel good about themselves. And the real training in how to be a soldier came afterwards, came in what they call advanced training. For the infantry it was AIT training, advanced infantry training, and that lasted about 6 months. So we have this mindset in our culture that if it's valuable, it has to be difficult. Gold is valuable because you can't just make it. Diamonds are valuable because they were hard to find. Now, it's possible now that there's more than enough diamonds that people could flood the market and drastically drive the price of diamonds down. But nevertheless, they're withholding them. They're making them rare. They're withholding them from the market in order to keep the prices high. So if something is difficult, if something is difficult, it has a perceived value. And if something is easy, well, then there's no value to it. There's no struggle. There's no sense of completion or competition. There's no sense of overcoming. And in our culture, that's built in. We have this inherent bias in our economy, in our country, in our economic system, that anybody who is willing to work, can make it. And those people who are poor because they're not willing to work. That's kind of a bias that's built into our society. And if you listen to our politicians, you will hear that. You will hear that. I call it the pyramid marketing school of economy. You know, everybody who's at the bottom of the pyramid thinks if they just work a little bit harder, they'll work their way up to the top, without realizing that the system is designed that, you know, you're probably not going to make it. So we have, even in our society, we look down upon the people who can't make it, and we think, well, something's wrong with them. See, they're not working hard enough. All it takes is working hard. And when something happens in the system, you know, like the things that have been happening since the 70s and on, when the system starts to not be able to support that 95%, and more people start falling out of the system, start entering into the lower levels of the economic classes, well, then people start to question whether the system's right and the system's working. And this is what leads to revolutions, whether they be political revolutions or actual, you know, like the French Revolution, those sorts of things. My only point with bringing that all in is that we have to be aware that in our society, in our culture, we have decided that things need to be tough if they are to be valuable. Many years ago, we went to a miniature golf course with some of our friends. In fact, it has to be almost 40 years ago now, because the little boy I'm telling you about is at least 41 years old now. And he might have been 2 or 3 at the time. And we went to this miniature golf course on a family outing, and he didn't know what was going on. He had never been there before. You know, he was just a little guy happy to be with everybody. And his dad hands him the ball and says, now this ball is red. You have the red ball. You have to remember that you had a red ball. Do you understand that? And of course, the little guy's nodding like he did, you know. And he hands him the putter, and he says, now here's the putter. And he says, now what you're going to do is, the object is to get the ball in the hole down there. You see the hole down there? The little guy's nodding his head, you know. And we're standing, of course, where you're supposed to put the ball on the little tee and knock it down the course. And he says, okay, go ahead, the dad says. And the little guy grabs his red ball, and he proudly walks right down the green of the miniature golf course and bends over and drops the ball in the hole. And he turns around and he looks and he says, like, you know, what's the big deal? You know, and of course we're all laughing, you know. He did exactly what he was told to do. He got the ball in the hole. But see, that didn't work for us. See, the adults, we have to be able to knock it and go through the windmill and go around all the obstacles in there and go over the bumps and try to bounce it off the side rail. And we have to do all these other things to make it difficult, see. Because it wasn't the fact that getting the ball in the hole was really the object. It was getting the ball in the hole in a difficult manner, right? The whole thing was designed that it had to be difficult. At least it had to appear difficult. So what does this have to do with our lives? And what does this have to do with our spiritual growth? Well, if you think about what is the most valuable thing in your life, I would say it's your spiritual growth. What could be more valuable than that? What is more enduring than your conscious awareness of your unity with life, of the presence and the activity of God in, as, and through you? Everything else, you know, all of these things that people are getting excited about these days, all of this is turning to dust. All of this is going away. You have to keep this in perspective. These huge cities that we're building, someday the tectonic plate will slide back into the mantle of the earth, and all of these huge cities that we've built will return to the molten lava. All the businesses that people are struggling to make lots and lots of money and survive, It will all fail someday. The economy will change, you know. I mean, look at what's going on now. Sears, which when many of us were growing up, Sears was kind of the icon of retail. Remember when the little red Christmas book would come and the kids would just sit there and spend days and weeks just looking at all the toys in the Christmas catalog and circling the ones they wanted with their crayons, you know. And now that whole thing is going away. Things change. Everything changes, and we have to understand the impermanence of all nature. This is one of the basic tenets of Buddhism. Everything is impermanent. Everything is impermanent. Some of their monks, when they're developing in the monastery, what they do is they send the monks out to the cremation grounds and have them sit there and meditate on the burning bodies for days or for weeks, to just sit there and meditate and see corpse after corpse come in and be reduced to ashes, and another pile of wood and another corpse and another pile of ashes. And it instills in them this awareness that everything is impermanent. So if we start to grasp hold of the fact that most of the things that people are struggling for and struggling about are impermanent, it becomes much easier for us to let go. See, we have also been told that if we are to be happy, if we are to be joyful, that it requires something that is external to us. When I get this job, I will be happy. When I buy that car, I will be happy. When I have enough money to retire, I will be happy. When I marry that person, I will be happy. And our society's idea of happiness is all based on externals. And all of those externals are impermanent. They are impermanent. So if we come back then to religious thought, I don't think it's hard for anyone to see that in our traditional religions, the ones that influenced our Western culture, those people grew up in a tough environment. They lived in a desert, you know. The rainwater was literally the best wine of all. And some theologians think that in the wedding feast at Cana, when we're commonly told that Jesus turned water into wine, that actually he gave them water. And that's why they said, this is the best wine of all. This is the best wine of all. They lived in the desert. The shade is a matter of life and death, right? And this is why we're told, he who dwells in the house of the Lord abides in the shadow of the Almighty. A shadow in the heat of the day was very, very important. People had to grow crops. They had a struggle to grow crops in the arid environment. So they believe we have to eat our bread by the sweat of our brow. Life was hard. Life was hard. And they bring this kind of worldview of things have to be hard. They bring this into their religious thought as well. Now, I guess we probably need to just say that clearly. The concept that people have of God is typically a projection of themselves that they put onto God. God can be mean, and God can be angry, and God can have enemies, and all of these human emotions. As Emmett Fox said, it's like they turn God into a tyrant, into some type of an emperor, you know. So when I have an enemy, it must be God's enemy, and God is going to smite my enemies for me, and all of these things. So a lot of what we have in religious thought about ideas of God are human ideas that are projected onto God. So the human experience was difficult, and they project this difficulty onto God. God is making it difficult for them. They have to struggle to get to God. Someone once said, and I haven't gone to count myself, but someone once said that if you go through the Old Testament, there are 611 different rules. Now, these are 611 things that you either you must do or you must not do, and you must either do or do not do them on a daily basis. So there's 611 rules and regulations that each person needs to follow each and every day in order to to lead a spiritual life. And of course that's impossible. You know, it's I can do coffee, and I can do breakfast, and I can do a nap, you know, so I've got about 3 things going for me. But 611 different things every day, it's totally impossible. It's totally impossible for anybody to do it. And what that does then is it creates the sense of failure. Well, I failed today to do these other, 608 things that I was supposed to do. And this idea that the reason that we struggle, the reason that we're struggling is because we're being punished because we don't do what God told us to do, is part of this mindset that which is valuable. Excuse me. I think we're going to have a weather announcement here. I just need to pause. Thank you, Lori. Lori just unplugged it for me. Sorry about that. Sometimes I forget I got all these things plugged in. So part of this idea that there's 611 different things that we need to do falls right into the value system that says, yeah, but you see, the most valuable thing in our life, most valuable thing in our life is our experience of God, our salvation, if you want to call it that. And because that's so valuable, it needs to be difficult, and we need to make it hard. We need to follow all these rules. We need to do all these things. We need to not do all these things. And of course, what happens is if you do that, is your mind on God, or is your mind on your behavior, your mind on what you're doing or you're not doing? So I just wanted to bring that in, and what we want to recognize then is we want to take a step back and say, that's not the way. Making it hard is not the way. Struggling to make lots of money when money itself is turning to dust is not the way. There's something more valuable, you see. And that which is more valuable is nearer than our hands and feet. It is closer than our breath. And it is joy. And it is joy. So rather than getting caught up into the cultural ideas that it needs to be difficult, we want to bring our mind to the fact that God never struggles. What would God struggle against? Why would God struggle? Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us, do you really understand what all-powerful is? All-powerful. Do you really understand what all-knowing is? Do you really understand what all-presence is? Because if we did, we would not worry. We would not be afraid. We would not think that we must work harder. We must struggle more. We must try to win. We must try to prevail. We must make the game difficult when the game doesn't need to be difficult. And we would recognize that it's already here. It's already here. See, in the eastern part of the world, or in environments where life was easier, the people who grew up in a lush jungle environment where there was plenty of food just growing naturally out on the trees, the people in the South Pacific Islands who virtually lived in a paradise, you know. What they needed was right there on the trees, or was swimming in the lagoons, and it was plentiful. These people didn't struggle for their existence. And their idea of God was totally different. Completely different. And what happened? What happened when the cultures collided? What happened when the Europeans got on their ships and sailed to the South Pacific Island? The Europeans said, oh my God, these people are lazy. They're not doing anything. They're not struggling. They're not working hard. We need to make them work hard for the salvation of their soul and for their own good. So we'll build plantations and we'll make them work on plantations to grow sugar to send back to Europe to make people there wealthy. Instead of just saying, wow, wow, this whole idea that life has to be a struggle is only one point of view. And there's another way. So now we're going to switch to that other way. Now we're going to recognize that the most important thing that we need to stay alive is the air that we breathe. And we never have to worry about that. We never think about that. We never struggle for that unless we're having some kind of a difficulty, some kind of an illness. We think about a child when a child comes into the world, how easily it accepts the good that is waiting for it. As I've mentioned many times before, the little lungs have been prepared for months, breathing in the fluid, and during the birthing process, as the baby comes down the birth canal, the lungs are compressed and all of the fluid is expelled, so that when its little head comes into the world and its chest comes into the world and expands naturally through the grace of God, not through any conscious act of its own, but through the grace of God, it breathes the air that is there waiting for it. The photons of light that reach us today, we're told, have been bouncing around inside the sun for 1 million years before they manage to escape and make their way here. And I love to ponder that and think, 1 million years ago, God created the sunrise for us today. How we are cared for, how we are provided for. Now, of course, human beings in our ignorance, we can pollute the air and we can pollute the water and we can make the skies gray, but that doesn't change the fact that the goodness of God has already provided for us. Life was never meant to be a struggle. We have made it a struggle. We have drawn invisible lines on maps and made it a struggle. We have taken the good that is there and we have tried to dam it up and divert it and claim it to be our own at the expense of others. And part of that is because we don't recognize our oneness, our unity with all of life. And that what we do unto our brother, we are in fact doing unto ourselves. So Dr. Holmes tells us that really what we're talking about today is happiness and joy. What happiness comes from is it comes from an inner sense of peace, an inner sense of knowing, of feeling connected to all of life, of feeling that we belong. And this is joy. This is joy. Now, if you read the dictionary definition of joy, it kind of has a great gamut, a great range of joy in there. It goes everywhere from a sense of, pleasure or happiness, all the way to bliss or rapture. Bliss or rapture. And I think that that's probably the highest description of joy that the human mind can express, can understand. And there's a level that goes beyond that. There's an ineffable level of joy. This is why I think sometimes we go into a deep meditation and we come out and there's tears just streaming down our cheeks. We have this feeling, this ineffable something, and it's like our eyes have never seen the light before, and they're brought to tears. This overwhelming sense that the presence is here. And not only is it here, but it cares for me. And not only does it care for me, but it is expressing itself as me. That is the feeling that goes beyond what bliss and rapture can possibly express. So if we are to consider that the struggle and the strife and all of the other things that our culture has told us are necessary for something to be valuable, if we can consider that that is only an idea, that is only an opinion, that is only an agreement of the human mind, and not all human minds agree to it. If we consider that God never intended for any of that, but that we, human beings, made those rules, we can then begin our spiritual quest of joy. So what is it that brings you joy? What is it that when you get up in the morning, if you had all the money that you needed to live, if you knew that you were connected to all of life, if everything had been provided, which it has, as a small child, you didn't worry. Most of us didn't worry any. I'm sure some of us probably were in an environment where we had to, but most of us didn't. But even if we did, consider now, look at children who don't have a care in the world. They're just here. They're just playful. They're just joyful. They're not gonna, when they're hungry, somebody will feed them. When they're cold, somebody will bring them inside or give them a blanket. When they're tired, they put their little heads down and go to sleep. It always amazed me when the children were toddlers, how they'd be sitting there on the floor playing with their toys one minute, and you turn over the next, and they were just completely sound asleep. In the most awkward position the human body could be twisted in. It didn't matter to them. They just surrendered to their sleep. So we're told to come as little children. Remember the parable? Jesus was sitting teaching, and the children wanted to come, and the adults wanted to keep them away. And he said, let them come to me, because unless you come to me as a small child, you won't enter the kingdom. So we want to consider if we could approach life in that state of innocence, the state of innocence before we have been taught how to be afraid, the state of innocence before we have learned that life can be cruel and we need to work hard. We have to struggle to get that A+ so Mom will hang it on the fridge. If we could imagine that we can go into that place in consciousness today. We don't have to go back in time, because there's no time and space in the mind of God. But to enter that place in consciousness where we trust, where we recognize that God is all there is, where we feel the presence, where we feel the power, and we feel the joy of living. So what is it you would do if there was no other reason to live but to be joyful? What is it that you would do? Who would you go be with? What would you read? What movies would you see? What song would you sing? What would you do just for the sake of doing it? Just for the sake of experiencing it? Where would you go? What places would you visit? And why? Why? What is that feeling of joy? What is that feeling of joy that each of those things bring to you? So I'd like you to consider then that our life and our spiritual growth, instead of being a struggle of all of these things that we ought to do and ought not to do, our life and our spiritual growth is about learning to be. Learning to be. I was reading something this morning from a Buddhist teacher, and he said that when we learn to meditate on non-meditation, we will reach enlightenment. It's kind of like the Chinese doing non-doing. Doing non-doing. See, if we sit down and meditate and we turn it into a task, into a struggle, and we think, oh, well, I've got to remember how to count my breaths. I've got to remember how to sit. Now, does the right palm go over the left, or does the left palm go over the right? And my feet, are they in the right position? And am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? Am I thinking too much? Am I not thinking too much? Did I fall asleep? All of these different things that we do when we sit down to just simply be. Right? Meditating to me is just being. We're just being. So we sit down to meditate and we turn it into a task. We turn it into a struggle. We turn it into a competition because our society tells us that struggle and competition is necessary for it to be valuable. But when we can meditate on non-meditating, when we can bring our entire attention to non-meditating, just being, then we enter into the oneness. So let joy be our compass. What is it that brings the experience of joy to us? And we understand that it is not something out there. Perhaps a better way to describe it is what is it that lets the joy that is already within us flow? What is it that gets us excited about life? What is it that we really feel good about? To me, I love the example of the small child I told you about who came to Sunday school. He was about 4 and he came to Sunday school. It was my turn to teach Sunday school. And his parents had just bought him a little science kit at the science store at the mall. And it had a magnifying glass, and it had a specimens jar, and it had a little pith helmet and a butterfly net. It had all these little things that would just, absolutely fascinate a 4-year-old child. And I had a lesson prepared. We had curriculum, we had little coloring sheets the kids were supposed to color and things that they were going to take home so Mom could put on the fridge. This was all laid out. It was a task. And this little guy just wanted to look at his magnifying glass. There was only one kid in the Sunday school that day. So finally I realized the lesson wasn't on the paper. The lesson was in his curiosity. The lesson was in what it was that he was fascinated with. So we put his little pith helmet on, and we got his magnifying glass, and we got his butterfly net, and we got a specimen jar, and we went outside. And for the whole hour that service was going on, and I had this little guy in my care, we went around the neighborhood, and everywhere we looked, I said, "Can you see that? Can you see that weed? That is a perfect expression of God. That is the perfect flower for the soil that is here right now. Oh, look at this bug." And we would find little bugs, when he would try to look at the little bug through the magnifying glass and catch the little bug in his net and put the bug in his jar. And we went around the whole neighborhood. We went into vacant lots. We went into places that weren't necessarily the cleanest in the world. But we talked about taking care of things, and we talked about cleaning things up and bringing some trash back with us. And the whole lesson became just being one with nature, just being in our life. And when we were heading back into the building, we took the lid off of the jar, and we let all of these little bugs go back to being the bugs that God made them to be. And I think in some ways it might have been the best Sunday school lesson I ever learned or I ever taught. You see, it didn't have to be hard. We didn't have to stay in the lines. We didn't have to color what was there. But we had to take time to find what was joyful. We had to take time to catch God being God. So joy then is our spiritual path. When these ideas of struggle and strife and things need to be hard and all of that come to mind, dismiss them. Dismiss them. They are only human constructs. God has never been worried. God can never struggle. God never will struggle. All of those ideas of lack and limitation and need to struggle are man-made. Dismiss them. We turn away from that now. That's no longer our path. It may have been in the past, but it is no longer our path. When we sit down to do our spiritual practice, we release and let go of the idea that it has to be a specific way. Something very definite in a certain way has to happen. And we just sit down and recognize the presence. Okay, God, I'm yours. Your servant listens. I'm here. That's all. Just take time to be. Take time to be. Use gratitude. Use gratitude as a tool to help you see the goodness in everything. We'd be grateful that the sun came up this morning. Are we happy with all of us who are getting this rain this day? What that's going to do for our rivers and our streams and for the watersheds, what it's going to do for the vegetation and for the animals, for the crops, for the food that we're going to eat. Where would we be without it? The air that we breathe. The opportunity this day to love, to be compassionate, to recognize the presence of God in each and every one. Can we be that unconditional love that we all want? Can we be that unconditional love that accepts people as they are without trying to change them or fix them or judge them? We recognize that people do stupid things. People do bad things. People do hateful things. But they do it out of their ignorance. We don't hate the people. We hate the ignorance. We hate the activity. We love our enemies. We bless those who would do us harm because we recognize the presence of God within each and every one. When we sit down for our breakfast, instead of quickly eating it all up while we read the paper or scan the headlines on the internet, can we stop for a moment to appreciate that this is the very love and the very activity of God that is taking the form of the food that is perfect and appropriate for these bodies, which were also created by the love and the activity of God. So life then is not a struggle. Life then is experiencing the joy, experiencing the bliss. Frequently when you see statues of the Buddha, it's the laughing Buddha. Frequently when you see the Dalai Lama on TV, he's chuckling. What does he have to chuckle about? His homeland was invaded. He was sent into exile. His people were slaughtered. And yet he can find some joy in life. Viktor Frankl tells us that he made up his mind to be happy in Auschwitz. Your happiness and your joy do not depend on externals. They depend only upon your willingness to go in and release it. And you don't have to make it a struggle to get in there and try to find each and every idea in your mind that is unlike joy and figure out where it came from and pull it up like a weed and toss it away. Because when the light lights, it dispels the darkness. So I invite you this day and I invite you this week, make some time deliberately. Just sit and be with the presence. Recognize that the joy of God is already within you. It created you out of itself to express itself. Find those things in which you feel joyful and do them. If you want to paint, paint. If you want to color, color. If you want to sing, sing. Go to the library and watch the children at story time at the library. Maybe you could even volunteer to read them a book. Do you love reading? You know, they have literacy programs where you can go and volunteer your time to help people who don't know how to read yet. You can help them learn how to read. Think of how that changes someone's life. How much joy you could be passing on. See, there's ways for you to find, to express the joy that is within you if you will remove the constraints that this needs to be difficult, this needs to be hard, and I need to get paid for it. Open up that fountain of joy that is within and watch what happens. From this day forward, let joy be your spiritual path. Let gratitude be your spiritual practice. In all things give thanks. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us be glad and let us rejoice in it. But that requires us to intend to do so. Let this be the week that we intend. And so it is.